thank you just for being a wonderful host. I've had a wonderful time being here so far. Dr. DeLeo just bounced on us. Where'd he go?
He shut the doors.
Thank you also to Dr. DeLeo for inviting me. Thank you guys all for coming. Are you guys students, people from the community, all over the place? Okay. It's so nice to have a community come out for literature. That's pretty rad. Like, hopefully, I'll try my best not to waste your time. Thank you to the provost for being here. How cool to have you here. Thank you. So my novel is called Land of Love and Drowning, and it's actually based on my family story. So I grew up hearing this crazy story that my great-grandfather was a ship captain. And it turns out that this story is actually true. It's in the history books in the Virgin Islands. He was a ship captain who owned a ship, and because of different things having to do with some of his religious beliefs, he was a Seventh-day Adventist, he decided not to sail on a particular Saturday from the coast of Dominica back home to the Virgin Islands. And so if you're a Seventh-day Adventist, you're not supposed to do a whole lot of stuff on Saturdays. You're supposed to, be in Sabbath. And so he decided he wouldn't sail. And so he waited until Sunday. Well, on Sunday, a hurricane came. And he sailed through the hurricane. And actually, his ship ended up going down in the storm. And this is a time period when captains were supposed to save everybody off on the ship. And if they couldn't save everybody, they had to die trying. I mean, this was like a real thing. And this is actually what happened to my great-grandfather. He died trying to save everybody. His ship going down was such a momentous thing in the Virgin Islands history that it was said that when that ship went down, every family in the Virgin Islands lost someone on that ship. It was this huge thing. This is my great-grandfather. My grandmother was his youngest child. She was 3. She was one of 8. And she doesn't really have any memories of her father because he went down. Her mother passed away just about a year later, so she was orphaned when she was about 4. My grandmother ended up raising me, and so this story was a story that I heard growing up. And when I thought I'm gonna write a novel, I was like, well, what the heck? This is the story I'm gonna use. I'm just gonna steal this shit from my family. And hopefully it's gonna be okay. And it's sort of been okay. So the story is actually based on that true story. Like what happened to that family after the ship went down. And it's based a lot, really heavily on my grandmother's life. What happened to her and how did she become this person, my grandmother? How did she turn into that person, my grandmother? And I wanted to sort of trace her life. And I got lots of stories from her, picked her brain, and had her read many, many drafts. This novel took me 11 years to write. Which people say, oh, it took me 2 years to write my novel, but I'm like, I want to give them the finger. But this novel took me a long time. And for me, that actually means that I was just throwing lots of emotion and history and family story, but I really wanted to get the story right because I knew that it wasn't just going to be my novel. It was also going to be the novel that was important to the people of the Virgin Islands because it was based on this like really momentous historical moment. It's actually, the ship goes down at the same time period that we're being transferred from Danish to American rule. So Virgin Islanders, myself included, are American citizens. But when my grandmother was born, she was a Danish citizen. So at the same time that she's losing her father, the entire Virgin Islands is sort of losing its patriarchy too. It's losing like who they think of as their fatherland, which was Denmark, and is getting a new sort of motherland, America. And so it was a time of great change in the Virgin Islands. I'm going to read a passage that's actually pretty deep into the novel. And I picked this passage in part because we consulted the Oracle. This crazy ass book that Dr. DeLeo has in his office. Which, if you're like, am I gonna pass the test? You can just go to his office and like ask the book, and the book will tell you. No, fake sick that day. Don't go in for the test or take the test. But I also wanted to read this passage because it has to do with things that are connected to the natural environment. And if you can believe this, there was a time in the Western Hemisphere where hurricanes were not a very occasional occurrence. When my grandmother was growing up, hurricanes were really rare. You didn't get them that often in the Caribbean. And now it's actually every season, we have a season called hurricane season because they come that often. And you're gonna get a bunch in the summer and in the early fall. It wasn't always like that. And this is actually set during a hurricane. It's based on my grandmother's experience, but also based on the first hurricane that I experienced my senior year of high school. So it's sort of putting together those two things. So now I'm just going to read this passage. And the character that is Annette is a character who's based on my grandmother. She's a grown-up now and has her own children and is maybe married to the wrong guy. That happens sometimes. Some hurricanes are numbered. Others are named. The latter have an identity or persona. For years, the name storms were only women, which seemed fitting. They could be in love. They could be envious. Now, whether this hurricane was the Virgin or the Magdalene, no one knew which Mary until it was too late. Hurricanes, like all important things, happen by the generation. Yumi and Frank, Annette's children, thought they were a thing of Caribbean folklore like pirates and mermaids, or of Caribbean myth like their Auntie Iona's Duene and Anansi. But because they were mythic, Yumi also knew that they would return. She believed in all the stories. As the radio directed, the family put up a map distributed by the government and drew a line from where the hurricane had started off the coast of Africa. They gridded in latitude and longitude. This was a game that the community played collectively. We watched Hurricane Mary grow, a mutant baby, as she traveled across the Atlantic. Then Mary was there, knocking on the door. Everyone was nervous and a little excited. No school, early off from work, all the bustling about, and Mervyn Manatee announcing on the radio, get ready, Hurricane Mary is coming. Annette's husband, Frankie, was a Coast Guardsman, and so he was the type to prepare. He sent his wife Annette out with his daughter Yumi to buy batteries to keep things working and nice things to eat in case the storm made anyone morose. Frankie and his son heaved a thick sheet of wood and nailed it over the windows at the front of the house. He called over to the sister island, St. John, and made sure that someone would pass and check on Auntie Iona's inn. After he secured their home, he went to check on his lighthouse. The Coast Guard had relieved him of lighthouse duty until after the storm, for it would be too dangerous. All the ships in the area had been alerted. When he returned, he ordered everyone to move all the valuables up onto the highest shelves. Now, Annette was a historian, and although she didn't really teach Virgin Islands history because, well, none of the schools thought it was necessary, she still listened for the local stories. So Annette had heard long ago about the tidal wave that swam the waterfront and washed up at the Anglican Church. She'd been told about the ancient earthquake that had knocked down the Peterson building. She knew about the old cholera that had taken a son from every family like a proper plague. She even knew about the sinking of the Homecoming, her father's ship. That was all history. Now at their house, Frankie was telling a story about the one time he had saved someone from drowning. In all his honorable years with the Coast Guard, this was the only time he'd saved anyone. Now, everyone said that Mary was an angry woman storm, either a jilted lover or a desperate mother. With a name like Mary, we should have known that she would be the worst ever. No one was prepared. The sepia portrait of the grandparents, Owen Arthur and Antoinette, was off the wall, packed up. The cruise ships had just turned away and headed for Jamaica. Ronalda's dorm was called and called, but she was at a SNCC meeting and didn't get home until curfew, which was 7 p.m. Phone curfew was 9. At 8:45, she finally returned the calls and said, "But there's nothing in the news up here in the States about the Virgin Islands at all. It's going to be okay, Mommy." But then Iona called from St. John and said, "Listen clearly, sister. It's not going to be okay." The rain was fighting to come into the house. Then pieces of galvanized tin were knocking on the door. And then the wind sounded like a woman howling out her broken heart. The radio station stopped its mix of American soul and island quilbe. Frantic men and women and children started calling in and screaming that their roofs were tearing off of their houses, that their children had gone out into the rain. Help! We live in Tutu. We live in the new housing development. We live still. Save us. The call came over the radio that all emergency personnel were needed. All. Police and doctors and firemen and of course the Coast Guard. Report now, immediately. When that call for the emergency personnel came over the radio in the Joseph house, Frankie looked over at his Annette. I have to go, he said. Frankie was in the Coast Guard, but he'd never dealt with a major emergency. When he joined the Guard, there hadn't even been formal training for that sort of thing. Most of his work was keeping the lighthouse, for goodness sake. And despite that, he'd never even seen a ship wrecked. He wasn't a surfman or even a coxswain. He just saved one person once on Cokie Beach when he was off duty. That was it. But he was going anyway. Annette watched him dress. Her husband was a seaman in a way, but the sea seemed as if it had swiveled upside down, was coming down on top of them. They would all soon drown. Annette watched how Frankie put on the heavy boots and jacket that he wore when they'd all gone to the States just a month ago to see Ronaldo settled. They hadn't thought much about America then. It had rained in the morning and the afternoon and into the night without even one break for sun. Who had ever heard of such a thing, raining all day? But now it was indeed raining all day. And Annette was glad that at least one of her children was up in the States and away from here. But Papa Frankie wished that Ronaldo was here. She was the child he most trusted to be in charge. I'm gonna be fine, Annie. Is a man I is. You be safe. You don't give me cause to worry. Annette nodded and felt the tears behind her cheekbones. Her husband had never called her by a nickname, Annie, before. It seemed too intimate for the time, as though there was something grave between them that must be given a sweetness. The rain was knocking hard against the back windows. In the living room, Yumi and Frank had gathered, unable to sleep anymore. It was 1 a.m. Frankie didn't like the idea of everyone there saying goodbye to him. He wasn't going to his death. He was going to save lives. He would be heroic. He would return. Annette didn't like it either. Her firstborn child was safe, but so far away. Her sister was safe and closer, but not close enough. Annette wanted most to be with the one she loved and who loved her. Frank hugged his father. Then Frankie went to Yumi and tapped her head gently though she was a small child. And finally, he kissed his wife Annette on the mouth, which was not something that children had ever seen them do before. Frankie opened the heavy door with a fierce push. The rain came sleeting into the living room. They all gasped and stepped back. Frankie stepped forward. He slapped the door behind of him. Annette looked at the closed door, still seeing her husband's back and the storm before him. Then Annette wished that her husband, Frankie, would die. Just a simple, shocking wish. Just the desire that Frankie never return. Wouldn't everything be fine if Frankie would drown? A hero's death wouldn't be so bad. Then Annette would have done her duty, stayed by him all these years because he stayed by her. And then she would be free, and then Jacob Mackenzie would arrive instead. Well, how strange to discover that Jacob Mackenzie was still among her beloveds, and not even among, but above. Annette hadn't wished anyone dead in so many years, and here she was, wishing it on her husband. But Annie didn't really want Frankie gone. He was a good father to all the children, a good husband to her. She would be devastated. She wouldn't know how to be a sensible woman. How would she cook the fish without the pepper sauce? She barely knew how to cook at all. No, she didn't want Frankie dead. It was just that she wanted Jacob. That was all. She just wanted Jacob to come, to take her and hold her and be her husband like he had promised. She hadn't felt such foolishness in years, and it was foolishness. She was just scared. She was just feeling abandoned because of the storm. So Annette focused on the door again. She stood staring at the door for a long time, conjuring the image of Frankie's back at the threshold, keeping him alive, overriding her earlier heedless thoughts. Jacob is married, she now reminded herself. Not free to claim her, even if she were free to be claimed. And who says he would be a good husband to her anyhow? Who said that they would still be in love now if she'd been his attainable wife? Leave that alone, she told herself. Frankie is your man. Frankie is who you need. At 5 a.m., Annette picked up the phone to call the lighthouse and check on Frankie. She found her phone line dead. Frank Jr. turned the transistor radio on high. Mervyn Manatee was declaring that everyone should open their windows. This would prevent implosion. This would prevent the pressure inside the house from rising and blowing the roof off. Frank opened the windows in the back of the house. The photo albums were sopping wet. They all felt their ears popping as they watched the roof. Oh, this was now a wild woman's storm. Frank kept checking on the latches and locks as his father had instructed. Even though he was the youngest, no one told him to settle down. He seemed professional and military-like. Annette observed him with a mother's secret pride, that mix of attraction and protection. The radio, on the other hand, was spewing horror. The hurricane had slowed down its movement. It had stopped altogether and settled over the Virgin Islands, dumping destruction like something premeditated and biblical. Police were radioing in, "This home is gone. That roof is gone." Then the directives of meek advice: hide in the bathtub. Pull a mattress over your head. Afterward, they would hear the stories of entire families who'd stuffed themselves into bathtubs with mattresses over them as their houses fell in. Help us. Help is coming. The Coast Guard is coming. Police are coming. Where is the doctor? Where are you? What is your address? Hello? Hello? The eye of the storm finally passed over the eye, a perfect metaphor for so many things. There was quiet all over the land, a peace, a light rain, sunshine coming from the unboarded back windows of the house. The radio warned not to leave your home because no one could know how long this calm would last before Mary started up again. Now Frank, who was baby-faced but almost a teenager, wrapped blankets around his body. Annette pretended she didn't notice he was heading out. She didn't think she could stop her son, so she didn't want to try and fail. There was something determined in him. In this chaos, he seemed to suddenly be a man. Now later, when he was fighting for the Revo in Grenada, she would tell the story of how he went out into the eye. But now Frank pulled the door that his father, Frankie, had left through and had not yet returned through, and young Frank went out into the stillness. Yumi and Annette laid sheets in bundles under all the doors and at the base of the windows to keep out the water that was still seeping in. They didn't put any at the front of the door until Frank returned, and when he did, a half hour later, he looked scared and brave. "I looked into the eye of the storm," he said, "and not a backside come in." The front at Mary had been bad, but her tail, like any Caribbean ass, was worse. Hurricane Mary lasted for 2 days. Mary was pissed. Then she eased away, sassy and slow and satisfied. In the afternoon after the hurricane, Yumi and Annette waded through the neighborhood. The ancient mahogany tree had been uprooted, thrown down in the gutter. There was an actual Maytag refrigerator lying on its side in the middle of the road. And most curious of all was the neighbors at the bottom of the street. In the middle of the debris, there was a bed, still standing, its headboard and all. Its sheet still tucked tightly, its pillows still plump at the head, while the entire rest of the house lay in splinters. If the bed had been a cross or a saint statue, everyone would have said it was God's miracle. Instead, Annette just looked at it, the bed, for a long while. But Frankie's house had, oddly and completely survived. When retrieved, the ancient picture of Antoinette and Owen Arthur seemed fresher than it had before. Life was changed on the island. It was not something new. It was not something opening or awakening. It was an expired life, even though there had only been 3 people who died amongst all the islands and they had been tourists. We had to climb over people's lives to get down the street. There were kitchen tables in the road. There were dressers crashed up against cars. And worst of all, those living in the valley could see the bare hills. There were houses there, so many houses. When had those been built? Who lived in them? And why were they so huge? These weren't homes that were connected to the town area. These were way up. The townspeople hadn't been paying attention. Yes, they owned their own land and their own houses, and yet it was something to realize that you were looked down upon. To realize all of a sudden, with the trees brushed away, that they didn't live in the prime location anymore. 24 hours after he walked out of the door, Frankie came home. A hero, not dead. He picked up his wife and spun her around and told her, "Thank God for life." Later, the island's mantra was belted over the radio, sung in the bread lines and phone lines, and taped onto packages of mosquito spray sent from the States. Thank God for life. It was declared that neighborhoods had saved each other. It was declared that the community was returning to its old-timey roots. We'd come together. We loved each other. We knew each other like we had before. Thank God for life. The island was months without electricity, months with the toilet flushing water drawn from the cistern underneath the house, months without tourism, without the revenue brought in. But thank God for this life. Thank you. My watch says 12:45. Is it not? What time is it?
No, I get 12:35. Yeah, we get time for something short if you want.
They're asking me to keep reading. Maybe I'll read like a little islandy section. Y'all know this island called Anegada? Have you ever heard of the island? There's a little island in the Caribbean called Anegada. It's actually where my family is historically from. It's a strange place. And if I can find this little tight section, I'll read it. This is Annette. She's talking about Anegada. And it's in the Caribbean vernacular, so I'm going to like suddenly take on this other persona. And read it in that persona. Let me tell you something I know about Anegada. Because I learned plenty somethings with this hard head of mine. I don't remember nothing before I turned 4 years old, but I don't need memory. Is a historian I is. I ain't never been Anegada, but I know enough. In all my years, I had never want to chase a child. I had want every child I ever conceive. But not every woman have that in she. I can't speak for those women. But I know Anegada wasn't no place to do nothing except make love. I mean, you know the place? You ever even seen a postcard of Anegada? It's too pretty. Like heaven and hell marry up and burnt up all the beauty, goodness, and badness could possibly make. You hearing me? And when you raise up in that place, like how my mama had raised up in that place, you only know about beauty and how to make it and love making. Now that's a beauty making. So it ain't nothing to imagine that Antoinette had come pregnant when she young. Probably for a nice boy, a lobster fisherman who have legs like bronze. And if this is so, you can't blame she. Everybody loving and beautifying, and the man sweet and tender. Besides, they have maybe like 15 girls and 15 boys on the whole island. Of course, they're going to meet up and mix up and mate up, and all of them is the most beautiful people you ever dream. And we could just imagine what a life is like back then. Fishing is life. Eating lobster twice a day is your life. Swimming in the ocean is life. Now, that sounds like leisure for any of we in the big city, but for them then, no. Because there ain't no hospital in Anegada. No doctors. If you're deading, you're just going to dead. Can't blame nobody. No police, no lawyers, no court. Because that's the place. Perfection, but with a hole in the middle. It's not an island really, it's an atoll. You know that word? You listening? So when a young captain get his young ship catch on the coral, what? Even if we just making this story up, we could easily say that Anegada girl named Antoinette is a siren. And her mother and father love she like the land, and they want what is best for she. They don't realize the girl have vision for herself beyond what the atoll know how to manage. So they convince the captain, and it don't take much for the young captain. Sure, he know that she have the other boy baby in she body. But the girl, remember, she's sweeter than lobster. The captain, he know about bush. He the kind of man know all about woman things. Swift as anything, captain and girl wash that other man baby away. The captain ain't know that he teach his wife the very thing she gonna use against him for the eternity of their marriage. So he gone with her. Love her till the day he dead, but also he own her in a way because of what he could make her do. Leave her fiance, get rid the not yet baby, leave Anegada and never return. Now, I ain't saying that this is what happened with my parents. This ain't true history. I just saying that given what we know about the place and about the time, my version seemed to have a little truth somewhere in it. Now, it's just a story that I'm telling you, but put it in your glass and drink it.